Well, welcome everyone to the next in our film screening series with Brim Film. I am Cutter Calloway, and I'm with my co-host Jasmine. There you go. I was letting you say hi. We are delighted to be joined today by two folks who are central part of the film, The Most Reluctant Convert, The Untold Story of C.S. Lewis. The director and writer of the screenplay, Norman Stone. Norman, thank you so much for joining us. And Max McLean, who wrote the stage play and also stars, as everyone knows now, as C.S. Lewis himself. Max, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I first want to just say, Norman, a quick greetings from a colleague of mine, Rob Johnston, who is sort of the godfather of theology and film. And is the reason we're even here today talking about spirituality and faith and movies. You and he partnered on something a couple of decades ago out here in Pasadena. So just want to say hi. And he brings his congratulations on a fantastic film.
Thank you. Give mine to him. He's a great guy. I was 3 at the time. I can't, of course.
So I thought we could maybe start, in addition to just saying thanks for a really compelling, interesting take on a person that we know, many of us know well, but through different avenues. I was really interested in the subtitle, The Untold Story. I wonder if you could tell us which parts of C.S. Lewis's story are you telling that were untold?
Took a little bit of license on that one, I have to say, but I know lots of people who are Narnia fans, even the science fiction trilogy fans and so on. What about the man who actually made it? Yes, he wrote his religious books. Yes, he wrote his deep, imagine the Joy Davidman and so on about the grief observed and so on. But what about the man himself? How did he get to where he was? I didn't know that much about this time in the First World War where he got blown up. I didn't know his father was such a fascinating but awful character in many ways. All this stuff makes the man and brings him to the point where faith actually tussles with him and brings him through. So I think that is, you'll have many, many things online and probably many films to come about C.S. Lewis in the more flashy spotlight moments. This turns out to be a richer, stronger, and I would say more entertaining movie, seeing him come from young and rampant atheism through to solid faith. So in that way, for people who just know about Lewis, I think it's a pretty untold story.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Max, do you have a similar, because you rooted it off of the stage play that was called the Most Reluctant Convert. How did you, the two of you, kind of come together in saying what aspects are we going to tell now in film relative to that stage play?
Well, the film follows the stage play very closely. In fact, Norman really wanted to do that, so I was really pleased by that decision. The untold story, there's a lot of scholars that none of this would be untold, of course, but there's something about film that just takes things to another dimension. And I think of the story that Norman told in 1980, early 80s, the Shadowlands story with Joy Davidman. That at that time, that was an untold story. And now, of course, it's quite well known, not so much because of people reading about it, but because they've seen Norman's BBC production or they saw the stage play. We actually did the first New York revival of it in 2017. Our company did. And then, of course, the film. So in a certain sense, what we're saying is untold via the medium of film.
Okay. Yeah. I thought it was really interesting that you guys began not just by breaking the fourth wall and inviting the viewer into this very intimate conversation, but you also took it a step further by merging the breaking of the fourth wall with this sort of behind the scenes look at the production process. It felt like you were setting the stage for this juxtaposition of theater and film. Mm-hmm. What was it that compelled you to make that choice, or had you considered doing it another way at any point?
Well, if I'll jump in there, basically, Max and I talked. He phoned me. I've known Max for many years, and I love what he does. And he phoned me one night, my time in Scotland. He was driving down to give another wowie hit performance of The Most Reluctant Convert on stage. And he said, Norman, is this play, it's going so well, is it ever going to see a screen? Do you think it would work on screen? To get a long story short, he sent me the script. And when I read it, I said, this is fantastic. And of course, realized it was Lewis's words. Max is a good tailor of Lewis, better than anyone I've seen. And he also adds his own stuff in there as well to measure it together. And it was a great one-man show. It really conquered the medium of that. But you couldn't just turn a camera and point it at a stage. Well, you could. I would suggest it's a little bit not right and a little bit boring. Perhaps if you just point a camera at the stage, fine. But at least people would hear about Lewis. But we now got a choice to go film it. So the options, as I went back to Max about this, I said, you could do the stage thing, take the audience to the theater. You could do one-man shows, which I've done a lot of on film with good actors, Jeremy Irons and people. And you can break the fourth wall with that, and you can take them places on real locations, where I always say real breath hangs in the air on a cold day. It's not in a studio. And that works really well. But I'd done a fair few of those. And I said, oh, there's something else. And he said, what's that? I said, it's the dangerous option. Now, I never say to Max McLean, it's a dangerous option, he'll do it. So I now know that. But he said, yeah, wow, that's interesting. What are you going to do? And I said, I don't know. But I know it's there. I smell it. I taste it. And if you remember, Max, you were kind enough to give me 6 weeks to prove my hasty words. So I went and thought about it a lot, thought about it as a director, thought about it from film, went back to basics, wanted to keep that massively good play and script that he got. And thought, why not invent? And I'll give you one key. There's lots more to say, but I won't bore you with. Here's the key for me. I love Christmas Carol. And when Scrooge, the not yet repentant but getting there, old sinner of a cash-packed bondage area, he goes with the ghost of Christmas past, and he takes him back to his school, where he's the last little boy left behind, nowhere to go to because of his bad background and so on, and his sister rescues him. And I found that very moving. And you know, I found it most moving because Scrooge himself, the old guy, is with a ruined life, is looking back and seeing him then at the age of 10, left alone at school, shivering and reading books to feed his imagination. What purpose, what point, what possibilities in that land. So I found that was great. And I've always loved that. And this provided the opportunity for me to expand that into film. And I didn't have that much fear because I'd already done so many one-man shows and played with things on that. Television and film and I suppose even Netflix and the streamers, all that tends to follow a line of drama. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's a young medium. Why are we not still pushing the bounds, trying things, going places and doing stuff? So I really, really enjoyed being allowed to play with Play-Doh on this one and see if it worked through. And Max, bless his cotton socks, allowed me to do that because he'd done such great things with it on stage. And then I just messed around and made this dangerous option, which it took a brave decision. And he made it. Under COVID, he made it. So I have a little secret idol in my room of Max McLean, which I bow to every day, because he actually did such a brave decision to make this work. And we all went together. Everyone was making the same film, key point in good films. And I think this is worthwhile watching, and I can call it good. I think it holds the audience and so on. And at that point, you've got to say, thank goodness we did it. Because if we hadn't done it at precisely the time, that position under the lockdowns of COVID, it was wrong before and he wouldn't have got it done after. It just fitted in. And that enabled us to have a free hand and a great crew. I must mention them. I picked them. They were really great.
Yeah, I would imagine. And so Max, you're either, according to Norman, an idol of his or Play-Doh putty in his hands. So I'm trying to put myself, I am not in any way an actor. So, but I'm trying to imagine what it takes to sort of embody C.S. Lewis on the stage and do something similar, but decidedly different for film. what were some of the challenges or opportunities, however you want to say that, of making that conversion, especially because you've performed it in both mediums?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a tough question, but with stage is big. You have to overcome space. So the imprint of stage is mostly the voice, and of course, stage is still has a real high place for words, especially words well spoken. In fact, I just saw on Broadway just last weekend the Lehman trilogy, which is a National Theater import. That's 3.5 hours of just words. I mean, I hope nobody ever complains about how many words I have, because they have 3 times as many as I do. So that's what stage is. Of course, film is image, and there's been less emphasis on words. So I was a little concerned, and then this was really my first film experience. And I didn't know how they, chop up the script in various pieces, 100 different pieces, and put them in a bundle, and then whatever comes out, that's the next scene you do. Because on stage you rehearse a play for, let's say, a month or 6 weeks in order, and you present it 6-8 times a week in order, and you build a there's a story arc that you're responsible for. In a film set, you have to bring that tiny piece at 100% for that moment, and then connect it to another tiny piece over there. And the fact that they work. I mean, one of the things I was very impressed by was how much attention was made to continuity. Getting this piece to go to that piece, so it looks like a very seamless performance. I had to trust Norman because I had absolutely nothing to do. I was Play-Doh in his hands. My job was to deliver for that moment what I could do in that moment. And thankfully, I had 3 years experience with the one-person show. Okay, and so I had this emotional memory that I could count on, that I could bring to that moment. I think it would have been really hard for particularly this script with this language, that it would be very hard if you hadn't had that experience to be able to jump in the way we had to do it, because we filmed it all in a month. And he made the point about it being during COVID. That's so true, because this wouldn't have happened without COVID. We had we were touring. We had national tours of Screwtape Letters, The Great Divorce. We had a college tour of this show, Most Reluctant Convert, that plays it. It's really has a great audience on college campuses. And then we had just closed a show in New York, a modern adaptation of Paradise Lost. All that shut down. And at first we thought, okay, it's going to be short. You remember 15 days to flatten the curve? Yeah. Well, what am I going to do for the next 2 weeks? But then when it became a long-term shutdown, we had, well, what am I going to do? What are we going to do? And then Norman said that the British government's going to open up filmmaking in Britain under strict restrictions beginning in August. And he could get a crew, he could get a cast if we were willing to act quickly. So I went to my board and says, can you give us the funding to get the film in the can? We'll worry about post-production. We'll worry about distribution later. And yes, got the rights from the C.S. Lewis estate. On August 31st of 2020, I was on a plane as big as Air Force One with fewer people on it to London. Quarantined for 2 weeks, began shooting middle of September. In the middle of October, we were done. And we had to take a myriad of COVID tests. And I think one positive test between me or Norman or, any other key people would have shut down the film, and it would never have been made. So it was providential that it all happened during this time. And here we are 1 year later about to release it.
Wow. I mean, you can tell when you're watching this that it's such a passion project for you, Max, knowing the history of it having been a play for you for 3 years. But beyond Lewis's life being so fascinating, what was it in particular that for you personally that compelled you to tell this story? Like, why was this story so important for you to tell?
Well, I've lived with Lewis. I'm an adult convert to Christianity. Lewis was one of the first books that was given me after the New Testament. I think I'd read the New Testament. I'd read the Brothers Karamazov. And then somebody gave me Surprised by Joy. I read it. I read it from start to finish, didn't understand a word of it. But I knew this guy was pretty smart. Then somebody said, I told him, I said, it's good, but I don't get it. And he's way over my head. So try this one. So he gave me Screw Tape Letters, page 1. I said, oh, I know this guy. This guy's been in my life for a long time. So I know this guy. So Lewis is, he's been in my imagination since my early days in Christ. Later on, make a long story short, we have a theater company in New York, and we produce theater from a Christian worldview meant to engage a diverse audience. So that leads me to Lewis. So I've adapted the Screw Tape Letters for the stage. I've adapted The Great Divorce for the stage. And both of those talk about his conversion or his resistance to conversion. They're both autobiographical. I mean, they're told from the devil's point of view, they're told from this point of view, but they're both autobiographical pictures in fantasy form, in fictional form. So that made me go back to Surprised by Joy. And I had a whole different, I came into it from a different way. And so I knew I wanted to tell this story after I reread it. And so what I ended up doing was I transcribed that book, from the very first sentence to the end, because I wanted to know what decision he was making to go this way as opposed to this way. And in that process, I got to know Lewis at a very deep level. I got to know his syntax. I got to know his self-deprecating humor, the way he used words, the way he used adjectives. And it just went deep in me. So I knew that if I stayed with it, I could see the character. I just needed to get there, and that took a long while. And so, what the benefit of the film, has the benefit of all that history that I brought to it, that Norman captured on film. And one more thing about that too is, when you do it on stage, you've got to project. You're hitting, way back. So to bring it down to the camera right here. Was really, I think, I trusted that. I trusted that the words and the intentions would really work at that small, intimate level.
I have about 3 million questions based off of what you just said. But Norman, I wonder, it'd be interesting to hear same response, or a response to Jasmine's same question of your reason for embracing, just maybe telling Lewis's story in general, but then specifically this project. What personally connects with you and Lewis?
Well, obviously, since I did Shadowlands back in the mid-'80s, heavens, that's a long time ago, and invented that from sort of scratch with the BBC. And I've done other films about Lewis since, but this one fascinated me. When I opened the script that Max sent, and he'd stitched together a very, very entertaining but true and moving script and I also had got to Lewis through these other films, and I've stayed at the Kilns and everything. I mean, just is wonderful. That's where he lived, of course. It rang true, and it rang true to the man. Now, the fact about Max not having been on film before, I seem to remember that was just before we went on film, or shortly before. And I said, really? And it's an interesting fact. None of the crew knew that. And they knew his performance was great. And that, for me, was wonderfully a great accolade to Max. But it was wonderful because that he fitted the film and fitted Lewis. What Max just said is right. He understood him, he knew him, and with a little bit of haircutting and makeup, he looked so worryingly like him. So it went like it. We were using a crew from Kenneth Branagh, who does so many films, that he uses them a lot. And we used a cameraman that I will work across continents to work with again, Sam Eastman. And when you get a chance, when you appreciate Lewis and you've been moved by Lewis and you've made work with Lewis, and you get this particular story from his youth right up to that, and it's his words telling you about them, that with the imagination that was already in the script, just cut loose the imagination of the film. So the beginning was a deliberate thing to do to wind in. You go through the veil of storytelling on screen and you end up there, and it's quite fascinating and it works, but you can play with that this time. You had such solid stonework from Max's knowledge of Lewis, and also from his experiences and on stage in particular with this play. So who would not say yes to that? It's good to know Max and I get on. We're different people, but we get on, and we sharpen each other up. I think that's true. And so Max would admit readily that he, was a theatre man rather than a film man. I'm a film man rather than a theatre man. But we, again, two souls who love each other, really get on well. Some interesting collisions take place, and it works. And because I had freedom, listen, this is the problem with being a freelance director. You take on work sometimes, and you're not in charge of your own beast, or it's like driving a car, but it's not your car, and somebody wants to get in and drive it for a while as well. You're hired to do that. That's nothing compared to something like this, where Max and I are both making the same film, making the same story, and there was freedom to create. The crew, who I spoke to, a top feature film crew, loved it. They were talking about it during lunch breaks. They were questioning it here and discussing it there. It just, everything went in the same direction. And that is so key to making a good film. Everyone makes the same film, everyone wants the same thing, and everyone gets surprised by what gets produced and created. I die for that.
I think probably the visual of that is opening scene, lights go down, first look to the camera. And I think, as I was thinking through the difference on stage versus there, that's where I would think it's a whole different starting point for you as an actor to go, how am I first connecting to the audience? And if I'm going through the lens of the camera, just a whole different way of embodying that. Your comments about transcribing it are fascinating to me, because a thinker that's influential in my life is a guy named Hans Georg Gadamer. And he translated a lot of Plato. And the way he says it is, I didn't just translate Plato, I translated Plato. And I think what he's getting at is you come to know and embody this author, this thinker, in this new or different way. So my question is based off of assuming you have a kind of expertise then, Max, of Lewis, that some of us don't, who have merely read his words versus transcribed and performed them. And it's uniquely related to Surprised by Joy. So I find it really interesting that as I look at his narrative of his life and his conversion in particular, it seems to me that the arts and poetry and beauty are central to his turn, maybe the sort of the moment that around which everything else hinges. And yet, both in Surprised by Joy and then in this film, and I'm assuming in the script it was that way, it's not as emphasized, I don't think, in the film, but he does say these are mere signposts, sort of looking back. And I, as an interpreter of Lewis, want to say, no, you are underestimating those in your life. The arts and beauty were actually as significant as your sort of reasoning. What do you think about that as someone who knows Lewis in a different way? Do we have a right to look back and go, I think you missed something about your own self there that maybe is implicit in your story and then specifically in this film? Does that question make sense for you?
Yeah, it does. You mentioned signposts. He goes on, I don't have the exact words, but he goes on to how important signposts are when there's so few of them. But when they come very often, you tend to ignore them because you're on the right road. That's sort of where he ended. And I didn't take that as a minimization of Signposts. Because I think that Lewis and Signposts, in the way I heard you talk about it, is a metaphor for this longing, the desires that take us beyond this world. I think Lewis's genius is that he was always longing for another world. He says, I think, if I find in myself a desire that no experience in this world could satisfy, the most probable explanation is I was made for another world. His ability, and he said that, his lifelong ambition was to, after he converted, was to press on to that other country. And then he adds parenthetically, and if I could, to help others do the same. And I think he did do that. So I think for a spiritual, a theological, let me leave it at spiritual. And I'll say that in this way, because I think the great divide is this the only world we live in, or is there another world? Because the way we're trained, our postmodern culture, our secular culture, the way we're educated, leaves us to only look, or almost look minimally at this world, and to not look at the other world. And so we're starved for that world. We're so starved for it. And Lewis allows us to give pictures of that world. A lot of them become rational because he was so, he had two great guides. George MacDonald was his guide for fantasy, and G.K. Chesterton was his guide for his more apologetic work. But both those guys were geniuses, and both those guys were really imaginative. And Lewis had this marvelous way of blending the two. I think that in the film, the Fantastes element of it, there's a great scene of walking in the dark when he's talking about the occult, but the occult becomes, the despair that is the precursor to the light, the redemption to come, which was what Fantastes did. And he said it was like a scent of a flower you've not found, echoes of a tune you've not heard, news from a country you've never yet visited. And so he himself saw this other world. He didn't know where that world was. He certainly didn't think it was in the scriptures. He thought, he said, he said that chilled his imagination rather than expand it in his early days. And until that great conversation with Tolkien at the end, which was huge because basically it kind of united the imaginative, the desire with the reality of that this was the myth that became fact, the true myth in which all other myths point. And that, of course, opened the scriptures to him and allowed him to write in such a way that has been incredible since. I mean, his writing prior to his conversion was rubbish. He wrote 2 volumes of poetry that no one read. Actually, when you read back on it, they were so self-loathing and so, just so angry. And then from the moment of his conversion, it's when he found his voice. And not so much in poetry, but in prose, there was a literary flow that happened that would not cease till the day he died. And I think all of that is the combination of those signposts, as you say, that imaginative world and the rational world that he was able to put together in such a unique and wonderful way.
So with those signposts, those pivotal changes and the occult, this is something that I was just stuck on. Norman, the way that you illuminate and you construct all of these pivotal changes in his life was so captivating. I found that it really just piqued my curiosity every time I knew that there was going to be a shift. coming up. And I imagine that there had to be so many details that you did have to omit in order to pace the film well. But it seemed like you chose not to visually share that dark path that was so well described of Lewis's like occult experiences. Why was that? Because I kept waiting to see, you know, that Ouija board or, you know, these dark dungeons of women. Like I was like, what is happening? Where is this? Why was that not there?
So it was sort of an untold story, you're saying. So there we are, we're back to that. But the idea is we're following Lewis's voice. We're following Lewis's honesty, truth, and life. So this all came, I wouldn't say pre-cut, but Max had worked on this so long with with Lewis's own words, that we had a specific job to do. And in a way, although it is a film and a fresh take on the one-man show and theater, that had worked through in that way. So Max had done the hard work for that anyway, but correctly so, because we're looking at Lewis's progression through. And you could take so many bypath meadows, so many different ways and exploring different things. You'd end up with a very fascinating encyclopedia, but it wouldn't be a very good story. So what you have to do is making choices, as you know, in film, to which story to tell and how to tell it and what to omit. And I think Max had already made those decisions in his stage play that worked, and through it, it's very well balanced in drama. I could add to that and twist with that and play new techniques in film so that would actually not hinder or block people, but it would encourage them on, lure them on. So when it came to his playing around with or having influence with and against the occult, you probably know if you read Lewis's books, it goes back to a nurse and when he was a child who was into that sort of thing, and it creeps up, as occult can do, quietly bit by bit. And through his life, there was various things that drew him to this. What we had was a short shooting schedule, a script that made it work well, and a dark garden outside the kilns where he lived. Just not that we need to know that particularly, but he needed to be ruminating in an area that, frankly, apart from the witch in Narnia or something, you don't get it connect out with Lewis very much on the surface of his life. So it seemed sensible to stick with the story, stick with his thoughts, acknowledge it rather than avoid it. It's part of the stepping stones that he was on following through. And I was pleased, A, with Lewis's words, B, with the script that had been for the play, and C, what we could do with it. Boiled down, it was, and there's that lovely phrase that Max picked out. That evening, when he read Fantastis, my imagination was baptized. And Max, if I may say so, a perfectly timed pause. And then you say, the rest of me took a little longer. What's more to say? We're on with his journey after that. And I have to say, had it been missed out, I would have thought that was a cheat. Had it been overexpanded, it would have been unbalanced. It's a limited time of film. It works well within the balance. As a filmmaker, I think I would defend that totally. It works well and intrigues at the same time. And especially his definitions of joy. When he goes in from the garden and on that one single shot, closes the book, turns off the light, and he says a different thing every time. We were running late that night. We were having difficulty obeying the rules of working hours. So I said, Max, we're gonna have to do this on one shake rather than do all the fancy cutting around the house. And am I glad we did that? It just sails it in, and then he goes around and turns all the lights off, and you know what he means by joy and that siren call of that feeling. More than I've discovered more with that particular long shot making it work than reading 10 books. I got joy.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, the film is brilliant. So I would say in terms of omitting that, I think that it demonstrated how to tell a story without incorporating unnecessary indulgent distractions.
Yeah, I found it really interesting. I first go in and I was like, oh, am I going to be able to sit for exposition for this whole time. And I think Max.
But did study theology apparently, Keta. So
that's right. I know. But that's why I like film, because you do something different. But I think Max, so much credit goes to you for just, I mean, another performer, another human doing that, and I don't think I'm in it in that way. And so I deeply appreciated that that approach and the fact that you so executed so well. Jasmine and I, and some of the stuff that we do and talk about with film, sort of our, I guess, meta question is really has to do with sort of such a time as this. So anytime we're kind of watching a movie and asking, well, how does this connect in what way to our real life? So I wonder, maybe as sort of a final thought from both of you, and you can select who goes first, the clay master or the clay itself. But what would you say is that deeper sort of spiritual conversation that your film's inviting us to have about how Lewis's story connects to our lives?
Well, I'll give it a start. I touched on a little bit earlier in terms of how we're educated, how we're raised, the world we live in, and I see for me and a lot of people that I talk with that Lewis and kind of his crew, Tolkien a little bit, Charles Williams, that group, particularly that group at that time, are a bridge, kind of a bridge from the postmodern secular world that we live in, which values freedom so highly and will negotiate meaning and purpose so freely, so easily. And I think that Lewis, one of the great things, he read everything from the Greeks to the moderns, had a steel trap mind that could remember what he read, and had this extraordinary ability to translate it into perfect prose, or just gorgeous prose and speech. And he did all of that from a very specific worldview. And then the other thing that makes Lewis so helpful is he never, ever forgot what it felt like to disbelieve, because that was a big part. There's a tremendous line in one of his books that he says that he said the success of his broadcast talks during the 40s, during the Blitz, was that a believed idea. He said the talks were spoken from a position of belief, and then he adds to that, a believed idea feels different than an idea that's not believed. And he goes on to say, I believe that there is but one God and Jesus Christ, his only Son. I believe in prayer, in the second coming, in heaven and in hell. And in the context of his talk, he says, when bombs destroy our homes, talk of Armageddon no longer seem fanciful, as in this weak piping time of peace, to quote Richard III. So I do think that Lewis is this wonderful, wonderful bridge to what it feels like to go from unbelief to belief.
Okay, I'll follow on from that one, Max. You're right. He's also very relevant to the times. I mean, Lewis is selling more books per year now than he did when he was alive, many more. He's approaching 500 million sales of books. Something's getting right there, something's getting through. So his honesty, his clarity, his self-depreciating humor, his total commitment to truth, which I think is what in the end brought him through to faith in Christ. He wouldn't duck it when it came. And that, as a believed idea, meant that when he was there at the Blitz talks, that people, ordinary people around London and the rest of Britain, in pubs, would turn up the radio, and it was known many times that the landlord of these pubs would say, "Quiet, everybody, Mr. Lewis is on," which is fine. But can you imagine the pub these days? So he was doing that, and everyone listened. Now, why did they listen? Why? Well, partly because of all the things I've just said about Lewis. But also, Lewis was driving into the Blitz on the train to go to the BBC. He wasn't running away from it. He was going into the exploding bombs to tell them something that they didn't just know. They believed in a similar way to Max's talk there. They believed in the reality of death. Mrs. McCavity down the road went last night. Their husband got killed in the war yesterday, but it only got through to me today. Death looked them in the eye like a ravening wolf and went around. Now, have you heard of COVID? COVID today, I believe, and I'm speaking from London, COVID is probably the first time since the Blitz where people have had to face up to their mortality or duck and run away in self-delusion, not telling themselves. But I think Lewis and his words and his clarity, especially those talks on the BBC, which became Mere Christianity, please read that book, folks, were brilliant. Clear, simple, strong, true, and effective. And that's what we've got now. People who know what it's like to face everything from climate change, but especially COVID. I know people who've died, you probably do too. Therefore, is there any surprise that this man who had cut his teeth on all this other stuff decades ago is now really has got something big to say? And I think my proudest thing is that I think that Max and I have been able to produce something that is true to Lewis, highly entertaining film, and yet not cut out the content that makes you think. Content's important. It isn't just a cotton candy film. It would never work at that. But there's very little content going around. Have you noticed? DC Comics, hey, content. You know, that content works with film if it's done right. Content, the hungry sheep look up and are not fed is one of my favorite quotes at the moment from Milton. Let's feed them.
I think Jesus said that too.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to follow Milton or Jesus, so I think that's a good way to end it. Congratulations on a really well done film. I think I'm really interested to see how audiences view it and embrace it and the kind of conversations it starts. And we are both very thankful that you spent some time with us to talk a bit more about it and illuminate us in terms of where you're coming from. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, well done.
And otherwise, thank you everyone else who joined us for this conversation, and we will see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.